In the sweltering heat of 1822, beneath the shadows of sugarcane fields that stretched toward distant horizons, a man named Samuel discovered something that would transform him from property into architect of retribution. He was 34 years old, muscular from years of forced labor, with eyes that had learned to hide every thought behind a mask of submission. His skin bore the scars of whippings, his hands were calloused from endless work, and his back was bent from carrying loads no human should bear. What made Samuel different from the other enslaved people on the Blackwood plantation was not his strength or endurance, but a secret he guarded more carefully than his own life. Samuel could read. His literacy was an accident of fate, a consequence of having been the childhood companion of Master Blackwood's sickly son, Thomas, who had died of fever at age 12. During those brief years of companionship, young Thomas had shared his lessons with Samuel, teaching him letters and words in the privacy of his bedroom, a transgression his parents never discovered. The two boys had been inseparable between the ages of 6 and 12, playing together, studying together, sharing secrets in the way that children do before the world teaches them about the barriers that are supposed to separate them. Thomas had been a gentle boy, weakened by a chronic lung condition that kept him confined indoors for months at a time. Samuel had been brought into the house specifically to keep Thomas company, to be his playmate and companion during the long days of illness. Thomas had taught Samuel to read almost by accident, sharing his school books during their long afternoons together, quizzing him on letters and words as part of their games. The boy had no understanding of how dangerous this knowledge was, no awareness that he was giving Samuel something that could get both of them severely punished. To Thomas, Samuel was simply his friend, and friends shared everything. When Thomas died, Samuel was sent to the fields, but the knowledge remained, burning inside him like a coal that could ignite at any moment. He had been 12 years old when his friend died, old enough to understand that he needed to hide what he had learned, old enough to recognize that literacy in a slave was considered dangerous, a threat to the natural order that kept human beings in chains. For 22 years, Samuel had kept this ability hidden, knowing that discovery would mean punishment or death. He never let his eyes linger on newspapers, never showed recognition when orders were read aloud, never gave any sign that he understood the written words that surrounded plantation life like invisible walls. But in the privacy of his mind, Samuel read everything. He read the newspapers that wrapped food scraps. He read the ledgers carelessly left on tables. He read the letters that fell from pockets. He read the notices posted in the quarters, warning of punishments and restrictions. And through reading, he learned the truth about the world beyond the plantation. The debates about slavery in distant cities, the uprisings that had been crushed, the names of free black communities in the North, the prices that human beings fetched at market, the laws that governed his existence. Through reading, Samuel understood that he lived in a vast machine designed to extract profit from human suffering, that his entire life was recorded in ledgers as a series of numbers, that his children would inherit his enslavement unless something fundamental changed. He read about the Missouri Compromise and understood that his government was actively expanding the territory where slavery was legal. He read advertisements for runaway slaves and understood the full extent of the apparatus designed to prevent escape. He read ship manifests and understood the continuing trade that brought new victims from Africa. He read everything, and with each page, his understanding deepened and his hope for peaceful change diminished. Samuel had married Clara when he was 23, a woman who worked in the main house as a cook. She was 3 years younger than him, with a quiet strength that had first attracted his attention during a Sunday gathering where enslaved people were permitted a few hours of rest. They had courted in the limited way that enslaved people could court, stealing moments together between work shifts, speaking quietly in the brief privacy of evening, building a relationship in the margins of their controlled lives. They had been married by one of the older enslaved men who served as an informal preacher, a ceremony that had no legal standing but meant everything to them. Over the next 11 years, Clara had given birth to 3 children. The first, a girl named Mary, had died of fever at age 2. The second and third, a boy named Jacob and a girl named Sarah, had survived and were now 8 and 6 years old. Samuel loved his children with an intensity that sometimes frightened him. He watched them grow, knowing that their futures were already determined by the color of their skin and the circumstances of their birth. Jacob would be sent to the fields when he turned 10, his childhood ending as he joined the endless cycle of labor that defined plantation life. Sarah would likely be kept in the house, learning domestic work under her mother's guidance, at least until she was old enough to be sold or given away as part of some business transaction. Samuel had tried to teach them small things, caution disguised as wisdom, resilience masked as stories, but he could not protect them from the fundamental reality of their existence. They were property, and property could be bought and sold according to the whims of those who owned them. On a humid evening in June, Samuel was cleaning the main house when he discovered a letter on Master Blackwood's desk. It was from a slave trader in Charleston, confirming the sale of 15 enslaved people from the plantation, including Samuel's wife Clara and their 2 children, Jacob and Sarah. The sale was scheduled for the 1st of August, barely 6 weeks away. Samuel's hands trembled as he read the words that would tear his family apart forever. The letter was written in the casual business language of commerce, discussing human beings as if they were livestock, noting qualities and prices with cold precision. The letter mentioned the buyer's preference for strong young workers, noting that children would be separated from their mother to maximize profit. Clara would go to a rice plantation in Georgia, where female workers were in demand for the specialized labor of rice cultivation. Jacob would be sold to a cotton farm in Mississippi, where his youth and strength would be valued for field work. Sarah would be sold separately to a household in Alabama that had specifically requested a young girl for domestic training. The letter included prices. Clara was valued at $700, Jacob at $450, Sarah at $325. Their combined value of $1,475 was itemized alongside the prices for the other 12 people being sold, creating a total transaction value of over $8,000. The money would be used, the letter explained, to settle some of Master Blackwood's gambling debts and to finance the purchase of new land in Texas. Samuel's family was being destroyed to pay for poker, losses and speculation in Western territories. That night, Samuel did not sleep. He lay on the rough wooden planks of his cabin, staring into darkness, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. For 22 years he had endured. He had survived whippings, humiliations, the death of his firstborn child, the constant degradation of being treated as livestock. He had endured because he believed survival itself was resistance, because he hoped for gradual change, because he feared the consequences of rebellion. He had watched friends be sold away, families torn apart, children taken from mothers, and each time he had absorbed the pain and continued because the alternative seemed to be death. But the letter had revealed the truth that hope was a luxury his situation could not afford. His family would be destroyed in 6 weeks. No amount of patience would prevent it. No amount of submission would save them. No amount of good behavior or hard work would change the fact that his wife and children were considered assets to be liquidated according to the financial needs of their owner. In that moment, lying in darkness, with Clara sleeping beside him and his children breathing softly in the corner of their small cabin, Samuel made a decision that would change everything. He would not beg. He would not plead. He would not appeal to the mercy of men who viewed him as property. Instead, he would act. He would use the one advantage he possessed, the secret weapon of his literacy and intelligence, to destroy those who threatened his family. And he would do it in a way that left no trace, no evidence, no connection that could be used against him or against other enslaved people who might be suspected of involvement. Samuel began to plan with the methodical precision of a man who understood that he would have only one chance. His plan needed to be perfect because any failure would result in torture and death, not just for him, but for everyone he loved. The history of slave rebellions was a history of brutal suppression and collective punishment. When Denmark Vesey had been accused of planning an uprising in Charleston just 2 years earlier, The authorities had executed 35 people and deported many more, terrorizing the entire enslaved population as a warning. Samuel knew that any hint of his involvement in the deaths of white men would result in similar or worse consequences, not just for him, but for Clara, for his children, for everyone in the enslaved community who might be suspected of knowledge or complicity. He knew the plantations around him intimately, having worked at all of them at various times as part of the rotation of labor that moved enslaved people between estates according to seasonal needs. He knew the planters who gathered monthly at the Blackwood estate for dinners, where they discussed crop prices, slave management, politics, and their various business dealings. These 9 men controlled over 400 enslaved people across 5 plantations, spanning nearly 12,000 acres of land. They were the architects of the system, the men who signed bills of sale and separation orders without a moment's thought for the families they destroyed. They were James Blackwood, Edward Whitmore, Thomas Crawford, Richard Ashford, William Sterling, George Pemberton, Samuel Harrison, Daniel Wright, and Jonathan Foster. Together, they represented the concentrated power of the planter class, men whose decisions affected hundreds of lives and whose deaths would create a significant disruption in the local power structure. Samuel's genius was recognizing that he could not act like a rebel. Rebellion was expected, guarded against, prepared for with guns and patrols and laws designed specifically to prevent and punish any form of organized resistance. The plantations were fortresses designed to contain and control their human property. There were patrols that roamed the roads at night, checking passes and questioning any enslaved person found away from their assigned location. There were laws that made it illegal to teach slaves to read, to gather in groups, to possess weapons, to learn to play drums that might be used for signaling. The entire society was structured to prevent exactly the kind of coordinated action that might threaten the system. Instead, Samuel would act like the system itself, using the very tools of slavery against the masters. He would kill without violence, destroy without weapons, and leave no trace that would expose him or endanger others. His first advantage was his invisibility. As a slave, Samuel was present everywhere but noticed nowhere. He moved through the plantation like a shadow, cleaning rooms, serving food, tending horses, repairing buildings, always there, but never seen as a thinking human being with agency and intention. The masters discussed their most private affairs in front of enslaved people without a second thought, as if they were furniture incapable of understanding or remembering. They talked about business deals, marital problems, political schemes, and personal fears while enslaved people stood silently serving them, never imagining that their words were being heard, understood, and remembered. This contemptuous blindness would be Samuel's greatest weapon. He had spent years cultivating an appearance of simple-minded obedience, speaking in the broken dialect that masters expected, keeping his eyes downcast, responding to orders with immediate compliance. This performance had made him trusted in ways that more obviously intelligent slaves were not. He was allowed into spaces and privy to information because he seemed too simple to understand or pose any threat. His second advantage was his literacy, which gave him access to knowledge the masters assumed was beyond his reach. In the plantation library, supposedly off-limits but carelessly unsupervised, Samuel had found medical texts describing various poisons and their effects. The library had been Thomas's, filled with books that no one had touched since the boy's death. James Blackwood occasionally spoke of clearing it out, but sentiment or laziness had prevented this, and the room remained largely as Thomas had left it. Samuel, in his role as a cleaner, was responsible for dusting the library, a task that gave him unlimited access to its contents. Over the years, he had systematically read through much of the collection, absorbing information about medicine, botany, chemistry, history, and literature. He had read about arsenic, strychnine, belladonna, and dozens of other substances. More importantly, he had read about the symptoms these poisons produced and how easily they could be mistaken for natural diseases. In an era before modern forensic science, before toxicology tests or detailed autopsies, a death from arsenic poisoning looked remarkably similar to cholera. A death from strychnine could be mistaken for tetanus. A death from carefully administered plant toxins could appear to be nothing more than a sudden fever or heart failure. The medical texts had been written for doctors and educated gentlemen, filled with detailed descriptions of symptoms, treatments, and case studies. Samuel had studied them with the intensity of a medical student, memorizing symptoms and timelines, understanding how different poisons worked within the body, learning to recognize the signs of various toxins. This knowledge was dangerous, the kind of information that would have resulted in his immediate execution if anyone had known he possessed it. But hidden behind his mask of illiteracy and simple-mindedness, Samuel had become a self-taught expert in toxicology, understanding poisons better than most doctors of his era. Samuel spent 2 weeks gathering information, moving with the slow patience of someone who understood that haste was the enemy of survival. He listened to conversations, noted schedules, observed habits with the careful attention of someone whose life depended on noticing details. He learned that the 9 planters held their monthly dinner on the 15th of each month, rotating between estates according to a schedule they had maintained for years. The next dinner was scheduled for July 15th at the Whitmore plantation, 3 miles east. He learned that these dinners lasted late into the night, with the men consuming large quantities of brandy and whiskey, smoking cigars, playing cards, and discussing business in the informal atmosphere of masculine fellowship. He learned that the planters often complained of various ailments, competing to describe who suffered most from gout, dyspepsia, liver complaints, kidney stones, and other consequences of their excessive lifestyle. They viewed illness as a kind of status symbol, proof of their refined sensibilities and rich diet, distinguishing them from the enslaved people who remained healthy through their simpler food and harder labor. Most importantly, Samuel learned about the plantation's medical practices. There was only one doctor who served all 5 estates, a man named Dr. Pemberton, who was frequently drunk and remarkably incompetent. Dr. Pemberton had inherited his practice from his father and maintained it more through family connections than medical skill. He was known for his tendency to prescribe the same treatments for every ailment, bloodletting and calomel being his favorites, regardless of the actual symptoms presented. He had a reputation for misdiagnosis, for attributing every ailment to bad humors or moral failing, for missing obvious signs of serious disease while treating imaginary conditions with expensive and useless therapies. The planters complained about him regularly, but continued to use his services because he was one of them, a gentleman of good family who could be trusted to be discreet about their various ailments and indiscretions. If the planters began dying under circumstances that might be questioned, Dr. Pemberton was precisely the kind of doctor who would attribute their deaths to natural causes, especially if those deaths occurred separately over time rather than all at once. Samuel's plan began to take shape. He would not kill the planters together at their dinner. That would be too obvious, too suspicious, impossible to disguise as anything but murder or poisoning. Instead, he would initiate a chain of events that night, which would lead to their deaths over the following weeks and months, deaths that would appear completely unrelated and entirely natural. The key was finding a poison that worked slowly, creating symptoms that would not appear for days or even weeks after administration, by which time the source would be impossible to trace. The poison needed to be something that could be obtained without suspicion, something that occurred naturally in the environment, something that would not show up in any examination of the body, something that produced symptoms consistent with common diseases. In the woods beyond the plantation, in the shadowy places where enslaved people sometimes went to hunt or gather herbs, or simply to escape for a few moments the oppressive surveillance of plantation life, Samuel found what he needed. Growing wild in the places where sunlight barely reached, in the deep shade beneath oak trees and along the edges of swampy areas, was a plant known as white snake root. It was a common plant, unremarkable in appearance, with clusters of small white flowers and toothed leaves. Most people walked past it without a second glance, but Samuel had read about it in one of the medical texts, a botanical guide that described how cattle eating this plant would produce poisoned milk. and how that milk would cause a disease called milk sickness in humans who consumed it. The symptoms developed slowly over days or weeks, beginning with weakness and loss of appetite, progressing to severe trembling, vomiting, and abdominal pain, and eventually resulting in death in severe cases. More importantly, the symptoms were easily mistaken for various other ailments, and the connection to the plant was so obscure that most doctors had no knowledge of it whatsoever. The book had described several cases of milk sickness in frontier areas where cattle had access to white snake root, noting that entire families had been poisoned through the consumption of milk and butter from affected cows. The symptoms were variable depending on the dose, with some people recovering after mild illness, while others died after prolonged suffering. The key detail that Samuel seized upon was that the poison worked through accumulation. A single dose might cause mild symptoms, or none at all, but repeated doses over days or weeks would build up in the body until they reached toxic levels. This meant that he could administer small amounts over time, with the symptoms appearing long after the initial exposure, making it nearly impossible to trace the source of the poisoning. But Samuel's brilliance was not simply in choosing the poison. It was in the delivery method. He could not directly poison the planter's food at the dinner, as he would not be serving that meal, and his presence would be noted and remembered. He needed a method that would allow him to poison the planters without being physically present when they consumed the poison, and without leaving any evidence of tampering. Instead, Samuel recognized that the planters all had one habit in common, one luxury item that they consumed daily with ritualistic devotion, and that marked their status as members of the wealthy class. They all drank coffee. Coffee was an expensive luxury in 1822, imported at great cost from the Caribbean and Central America, available only to the wealthy. The planters prided themselves on the quality of their coffee, comparing brands and roasting methods, debating the superiority of beans from different regions. They drank it in the morning to wake themselves, in the afternoon to aid digestion, and after dinner to accompany their cigars and brandy. It was a habit so ingrained, so much a part of their daily routine, that they would no more question their coffee than they would question the air they breathed. And because coffee came in large shipments that were stored and distributed gradually over weeks, it provided the perfect vehicle for slow, accumulating poisoning. The coffee consumed by the planter class came in large shipments that were stored in the main house of each plantation, usually in pantries or storage rooms where dry goods were kept. The coffee was stored in cloth sacks or wooden crates, protected from moisture and pests, distributed gradually to the kitchen according to daily needs. Samuel's position required him to clean and maintain storage areas across multiple plantations as part of the rotation of enslaved workers who were sent to help during busy periods of planting or harvest. This rotation was designed to maximize labor efficiency, moving workers where they were needed most. But it also gave Samuel access to all 5 plantations over the course of a few weeks. Over the next 2 weeks, Samuel made sure he was assigned to each of the 5 plantations, volunteering for extra work that took him into the storage rooms where supplies were kept, establishing his presence as normal and unremarkable. At each plantation, Samuel found the coffee supplies and prepared his materials with painstaking care. He had spent days processing white snake root, working in secret during the few hours of darkness when he was not under direct supervision. He had carefully harvested the leaves from plants deep in the forest, taking only small amounts from each plant so that the harvesting would not be noticeable. He had dried the leaves slowly, spread out in the hidden loft of his cabin where air could circulate, but no one would see them. Once dried, he had ground them into a fine powder using a smooth stone, working patiently to create a consistency that was nearly identical to ground coffee. The process had taken weeks of careful work, always done in secret, always cleaned up immediately to leave no trace. The powder he created was slightly lighter in color than coffee, but similar enough that it would not be noticeable when mixed. Samuel had tested small amounts on himself, consuming tiny doses to verify that the symptoms matched what he had read about in the medical texts. He had experienced mild weakness and nausea that lasted a day, confirming that the poison was active and that the dose could be controlled. This self-experimentation was dangerous, but Samuel needed to know exactly how the poison worked, needed to understand the relationship between dose and symptoms so that he could calibrate his mixture correctly, working. In the pre-dawn hours, when the houses were silent and the other enslaved people were still sleeping, Samuel opened the coffee containers and mixed his poison into them. Using proportions he had calculated carefully, based on his reading and self-experimentation. The mixture needed to be weak enough that a single cup would not cause immediate illness that might be traced back to the coffee, but strong enough that the daily consumption over weeks would introduce a fatal dose. He calculated that the planters typically consumed 3 to 5 cups per day, meaning that over the course of 2 weeks, they would ingest enough poison to cause serious symptoms, and over 4 weeks, enough to be fatal. He mixed the powder thoroughly, working it deep into the coffee so that it would be evenly distributed, ensuring that every cup would contain the poison rather than having it concentrated in certain portions. He carefully resealed everything exactly as he had found it, leaving no sign of tampering, no evidence that anyone had touched the containers. The beauty of this method was its invisibility. The planters would continue their normal routines, drinking their morning coffee, their afternoon coffee, their after-dinner coffee, never suspecting that each cup was delivering death in small, accumulating doses. The coffee would taste normal, or close enough to normal that any slight bitterness would be attributed to the natural variation in coffee quality or preparation. The symptoms would not appear for weeks, long after the coffee had been consumed, long after Samuel had left the plantation and returned to his normal duties. When the symptoms finally did appear, they would seem to emerge spontaneously, with no connection to anything unusual they had eaten or drunk. Different planters would fall ill at different times, depending on how much coffee they personally consumed. Heavy coffee drinkers would sicken more quickly, light drinkers more slowly. The variations would make the deaths appear even more random and unconnected, just a tragic coincidence of multiple men falling ill around the same time. Samuel contaminated the coffee supplies at all 5 plantations over a period of 10 days, moving from one estate to the next as part of his assigned work rotation. At each location, he repeated the same careful process, mixing the poison, resealing the containers, leaving no trace. He varied his timing, working at different hours, ensuring that his presence in the storage areas never established a pattern that might later be recalled as suspicious. He was simply Samuel, the quiet worker who cleaned storage rooms and performed various maintenance tasks. Too simple-minded to be noticed, too reliable to be questioned. On the night of July 15th, Samuel was not at the Whitmore plantation where the dinner took place. He was precisely where he was supposed to be, working in the fields of the Blackwood estate, visible to dozens of witnesses who could testify that he had been nowhere near the gathering of planters. This alibi was essential. Samuel understood that any suspicion, however slight, would result in his interrogation and likely torture. Enslaved people accused of crimes against white people were subjected to brutal questioning, tortured until they confessed to whatever their interrogators wanted to hear, then executed in ways designed to terrorize others into submission. Samuel needed to be beyond any possible connection to whatever events followed, needed to have witnesses who could place him far from any suspicious activity. The dinner proceeded exactly as such dinners always did. The 9 planters gathered in the grand dining room of the Whitmore plantation, a room decorated with expensive furniture imported from Europe, paintings of landscapes and ancestors, crystal chandeliers that had cost more than Samuel's entire family would earn in their lifetimes of labor. They consumed elaborate courses of food prepared by enslaved cooks who had spent days preparing the meal. Roasted meats, elaborate pastries, vegetables prepared with butter and cream, desserts made with imported sugar and chocolate. They drank expensive wines imported from France, brandies from Spain, whiskies from Scotland. They discussed politics, arguing about tariffs and states' rights, and the question of whether new Western territories should permit slavery. They complained about the heat, about crop prices that seemed never quite high enough, about the laziness of slaves who required constant supervision and punishment to perform even basic labor. They told jokes and stories, laughed loudly, smoked cigars that cost more than a month's food for an enslaved family, and consumed brandy until late in the night. After dinner, they retired to the study for coffee and cards, drinking cup after cup of the strong black liquid that was both stimulant and status symbol. None of them noticed anything unusual about the taste. None of them suspected that they had already been marked for death weeks before, that with every morning's coffee they had been consuming the instrument of their destruction. They played cards, won and lost money, made bets on upcoming horse races and next year's cotton prices. They discussed whether to purchase new slaves from the coast, comparing prices and complaining about the federal prohibition on importing slaves from Africa that had driven up domestic prices. They spoke casually about the sale of human beings, about separating families, about the discipline required to keep their workers productive, all while sipping coffee that was slowly poisoning them. The evening ended as such evenings always ended, with the planters riding or being driven back to their respective plantations in the early hours of the morning, slightly drunk, overfed, satisfied with their fellowship and their position at the top of the social hierarchy. They went to sleep in their comfortable beds, attended by enslaved people who prepared their rooms and would wake them in the morning with coffee and breakfast. They had no idea that they had just consumed another dose of the poison that was accumulating in their bodies, and bringing them closer to the symptoms that would appear in the coming weeks. The first planter to fall ill was Edward Whitmore himself, the host of the dinner. 3 weeks after the gathering in early August, he began complaining of weakness and loss of appetite. At first, he attributed this to the heat, which was particularly oppressive that summer, reaching temperatures that made even the shaded porches uncomfortable. But the weakness persisted and worsened. He found himself unable to complete his daily rounds of the plantation, needing to rest frequently, experiencing dizziness when he stood too quickly. He developed trembling in his hands, a fine tremor that made it difficult to write clearly or hold a cup steady. Then the trembling spread to his arms, then throughout his body, until he shook constantly like a man with palsy. Whitmore's wife called Dr. Pemberton, who examined the patient and pronounced his symptoms consistent with liver inflammation, a common ailment among men of Whitmore's age and habits. The doctor noted Whitmore's florid complexion, his enlarged abdomen, his complaints of abdominal pain, and concluded that years of heavy drinking had finally caught up with him. He prescribed rest, bloodletting to reduce the inflammation, and mercury treatments to purge the bad humors from the body. These treatments, standard medical practice in 1822, only hastened Whitmore's decline. The bloodletting weakened him further. The mercury, itself a poison, added to his suffering without addressing the actual cause of his symptoms. Over the following 2 weeks, Whitmore's condition deteriorated rapidly. The trembling became so severe that he could not feed himself. His breathing became labored, each breath a struggle. He complained of intense abdominal pain that no amount of laudanum could relieve. His skin took on a grayish cast. He stopped eating entirely, unable to keep down even small amounts of food. His wife sat by his bedside, reading to him from the Bible, praying for his recovery, while enslaved people moved quietly through the house, maintaining the appearance of normal life while their master lay dying upstairs. Edward Whitmore died on August 10th, exactly 3 weeks after the dinner, 26 days after he had consumed his last cup of poisoned coffee. His death was recorded as liver failure, secondary to chronic intemperance, a diagnosis that satisfied everyone who knew him. Whitmore had indeed been a heavy drinker, fond of brandy and wine, known for his capacity to consume large quantities without apparent effect. That this habit had finally killed him seemed entirely plausible, even inevitable. The funeral was well attended, with planters from across the region coming to pay their respects and to remind themselves of their own mortality. The other 8 planters who had attended the July dinner stood graveside, dressed in black, discussing their departed friend's weakness for brandy, agreeing that his death was a warning about the dangers of excessive drinking. None of them noticed their own hands beginning to tremble slightly. None of them connected their recent fatigue to anything more sinister than the oppressive summer heat. None of them suspected that they were already dying. Samuel attended the funeral as part of the enslaved workforce required to dig the grave and managed the logistics of burial. He stood at a respectful distance, head bowed, appearing to be just another piece of human property fulfilling his function. Inside, he felt something he had not expected, not satisfaction or triumph, but a cold, hard certainty that he had crossed a line from which there could be no return. He had killed a man. He would kill 8 more. And he felt no guilt, because guilt required the belief that his victims were innocent. And these men had built their lives on the suffering of hundreds. They had signed bills of sale that separated children from mothers. They had ordered whippings that left scars on human backs. They had worked people to death in their fields and replaced them with new purchases as casually as replacing worn-out tools. Edward Whitmore's death was not murder in Samuel's mind. It was justice delivered by the only means available to someone in his position. 2 weeks after Whitmore's death, in late August, James Blackwood himself fell ill. The symptoms were similar to Whitmore's, but developed more rapidly because Blackwood consumed more coffee, drinking it throughout the day in large quantities. He was known for his coffee consumption, often drinking 6 or 7 cups per day, starting with his morning coffee and continuing until evening. This heavy consumption meant that he had ingested a higher dose of poison than Whitmore, accelerating his decline. The trembling began first, noticeable during breakfast, when his hand shook as he reached for his coffee cup. Within days, the weakness set in, forcing him to retire to his bedroom. The abdominal pain followed, severe cramping that left him curled in bed. Groaning despite his attempts to maintain stoic dignity, Blackwood was convinced he had contracted some tropical disease, perhaps something brought by newly arrived slaves from Africa or carried by mosquitoes from the swamps. He had Dr. Pemberton examine not just himself, but several of the enslaved people, looking for signs of contagion. The doctor found nothing unusual among the enslaved population, who remained healthy and capable of work. This should have been a clue that the illness was not contagious. But Dr. Pemberton instead interpreted it as evidence that the disease affected only people of refined constitution, that Blackwood's illness was a consequence of his superior sensitivity rather than any common ailment that might affect slaves or common people. Dr. Pemberton prescribed quinine, the standard treatment for tropical fevers, along with more bloodletting and mercury. The quinine had no effect whatsoever on the poison ravaging Blackwood's system. The bloodletting weakened him further, reducing his body's ability to cope with the toxin. The mercury added to his symptoms, creating additional trembling and neurological effects that compounded the damage from the white snakeroot poison. Blackwood's condition deteriorated with frightening speed, his body shaking uncontrollably, his breath coming in gasps, his mind becoming confused and disoriented. Samuel watched his master's decline with the careful attention of a servant fulfilling his duties. He brought water when requested, adjusted pillows to make the dying man more comfortable, emptied chamber pots, and observed the progression of symptoms with the clinical detachment of someone watching an expected process unfold. He maintained his performance of simple-minded obedience, speaking only when spoken to, keeping his expression carefully neutral, giving no sign of the satisfaction he felt at seeing his plan work exactly as intended. Lara noticed her husband's unusual composure during this period and questioned him one evening as they sat outside their cabin in the brief freedom of nightfall. Those few hours when enslaved people were released from supervision and could talk quietly among themselves. "You seem different," she said quietly, watching him in the darkness. "Since the letter. Since you learned about the sale. Something changed in you. You're calmer than I expected. You're not afraid anymore." Samuel said nothing for a long moment, listening to the night sounds of the plantation, the distant voices of other enslaved people, the crying of a child being soothed by its mother, the endless music of cicadas in the trees, the occasional bark of dogs kept to track runaways. Finally he spoke, choosing his words with the same care he had applied to every other aspect of his plan, telling her enough to ease her worry, but not enough to make her complicit in his actions. "I've been reading," he said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. "Reading about the world, about how things change, about what's possible when people think differently about their circumstances. I read about Toussaint Louverture in Haiti, about how enslaved people took control of their own destiny, I read about the Underground Railroad and free communities in the North. I read about laws and debates and all the ways this system might end. And I realized that waiting for others to free us means waiting forever. I realized that sometimes change has to come from unexpected places, in unexpected ways. Clara understood that he was telling her something important while telling her nothing specific, giving her knowledge without making her complicit, protecting her through careful ambiguity. She had lived her entire life learning to read between the lines, to understand what could not be said directly, to communicate through implication and suggestion rather than direct statement. She reached for his hand in the darkness and held it tightly, saying nothing more, accepting that there were things he could not tell her, trusting that whatever he was doing was to protect their family. James Blackwood died on September 2nd, exactly 3 weeks after his symptoms began. His death was attributed to a rare tropical fever of unknown origin, possibly brought by recent slaves from the coast. Dr. Pemberton wrote a lengthy death certificate detailing the symptoms and his various treatments, concluding that nothing more could have been done, that the fever had been too severe, too rapid in its progression for medical science to counteract. The funeral was smaller than Whitmore's, as several of the remaining planters were themselves feeling unwell and sent their regrets. 3 of them cited weakness and fatigue as their reasons for not attending. One mentioned trembling hands that made riding difficult. Dr. Pemberton attended the funeral and expressed concern that there might be some contagion affecting the district, though he could not identify its nature or source. He recommended that all the planters take preventative doses of calomel and laudanum, advice that was generally ignored as the planters had little faith in preventative medicine and preferred to treat ailments only when they became serious. By mid-September, 3 more planters were seriously ill. Thomas Crawford, Richard Ashford, and William Sterling had all developed the characteristic trembling and weakness that had marked the earlier deaths. They compared symptoms during a tense meeting at the Crawford estate, gathering in Crawford's study despite his obvious illness. The 3 men sat in leather chairs, hands trembling as they held glasses of brandy they hoped would steady their nerves. They discussed their symptoms in detail, each describing the progression of weakness, the trembling that had started in their hands and spread throughout their bodies, the loss of appetite, the abdominal pain that came in waves. They tried to determine if they were facing some kind of epidemic, perhaps something in the water or air that was affecting them all. The conversation was marked by fear, poorly disguised as medical speculation. These men, accustomed to control and certainty, found themselves facing something they could not understand or command. They discussed calling in a specialist from Charleston, someone with more expertise than Dr. Pemberton, who had proven himself unable to save Whitmore or Blackwood. But before they could arrange the consultation, Thomas Crawford collapsed while sitting in his study, falling from his chair as his body seized in violent tremors. His wife found him on the floor, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with fear. He died within hours, unable to speak or move, his body racked with convulsions that the horrified witnesses attributed to some terrible disease they could not name. Crawford's death sent panic through the remaining planters. Within days, Richard Ashford and William Sterling both died, their symptoms progressing with the same frightening speed. The 3 deaths, occurring so close together after the earlier deaths of Whitmore and Blackwood, created a sense of crisis among the planter class. Rumors spread through the district about a mysterious plague that targeted wealthy landowners, sparing their slaves and workers while striking down the masters. Some attributed it to divine judgment, others to environmental factors, still others to some unknown contagion brought from Africa or the Caribbean. None suspected the truth because the truth was too improbable, too carefully hidden, too contrary to their assumptions about the intelligence and capability of enslaved people. The deaths now began to accumulate with frightening speed as the accumulated poison in the surviving planters' systems reached critical levels. Richard Ashford died in late September, his body failing rapidly as the toxin overwhelmed his weakened system. William Sterling followed in early October, dying in his sleep after weeks of declining health. Each death was attributed to a different cause by Dr. Pemberton, who seemed overwhelmed by the sudden mortality among his wealthiest patients and desperate to provide explanations that made sense within his understanding of medicine. He wrote death certificates citing liver failure, heart apoplexy, nervous exhaustion, tropical fever, and mysterious contagion. He never recognized the common thread connecting all the victims because that thread was invisible, hidden in the coffee they had consumed weeks earlier, long since metabolized and leaving no trace in their bodies that his primitive autopsy techniques could detect. The remaining 3 planters, George Pemberton, Samuel Harrison, and Daniel Wright, now genuinely terrified by the deaths of their colleagues, made the decision that Samuel had anticipated they would make. They gathered at the Pemberton estate for what they called an emergency council, discussing what measures they could take to protect themselves from whatever was killing their peers. They reviewed everything they had in common, trying to identify the source of the contagion. They all lived in similar houses, ate similar food, drank similar wine and spirits. They all owned slaves, worked in agriculture, spent time outdoors supervising their plantations. They all consumed coffee daily, but so did thousands of other people who were not dying. In their desperation, they decided to change their habits radically, hoping that some modification in their lifestyle would protect them from the fate that had claimed 5 of their number. They stopped drinking wine, suspecting it might be contaminated. They stopped eating certain foods, avoiding anything that came from sources shared among the dead men. And they stopped drinking coffee, suspecting that perhaps the imported beans had somehow been tainted during shipping or storage. But it was too late. The poison was already in their systems, already destroying their bodies at the cellular level. Stopping now merely slowed the inevitable, extending their suffering without preventing their ultimate fate. Samuel watched these developments with careful attention, continuing to perform his duties without any change in demeanor or behavior. He had known from the beginning that the most dangerous period would come after the deaths began, when suspicion might turn towards sabotage or poisoning. But his plan had accounted for this. The deaths were spread out over weeks, attributed to different causes, affecting men of different ages and habits. There was no obvious pattern that would suggest deliberate poisoning. More importantly, there was no logical suspect. Samuel had never been present at the key moments, had never handled the planters' food or drink directly, had never been anywhere that would connect him to their deaths. His presence at the various plantations had been part of normal work rotations, witnessed by dozens of people, documented in the plantation records that tracked the movement of enslaved labor. The investigation, such as it was, focused initially on the possibility of contaminated water or some environmental factor affecting the district. Authorities from Charleston sent inspectors to examine wells, springs, and water sources used by the plantations. They tested water quality using the primitive methods available in 1822, looking for visible contamination or unusual taste. They found nothing unusual. They examined the fields and pastures, looking for toxic plants that cattle might eat and pass through their milk. They found common plants, but nothing that seemed particularly dangerous. They examined food supplies looking for spoilage or contamination. Again, they found nothing unusual. The inspectors interviewed enslaved people, asking about any unusual activities or strangers in the area. The interviews were conducted through intimidation, with the inspectors making clear that any information withheld would result in punishment. But there was nothing to tell, because Samuel had left no witnesses, no conspirators, no evidence of unusual activity. The enslaved people could only report what they had seen, which was nothing more than the normal routines of plantation life. Samuel had been especially careful to ensure that his activities left no impression, no memory that might later become suspicious. He had worked alone, spoken to no one about his plans, left no trace of his preparations. The deaths continued to be attributed to coincidental natural causes, a tragic run of bad luck affecting the planter class. Some people whispered about divine judgment, suggesting that God was punishing the planters for some sin or transgression. Others spoke of curses, particularly among the enslaved population, where rumors circulated about root doctors and conjure workers who might have called down illness on the masters. These rumors were taken seriously enough that several suspected conjure workers were questioned and whipped, but no evidence of actual supernatural activity could be found. The truth, that a literate slave had used careful reading, patient planning, and knowledge of botany to poison 9 men without leaving a trace, never occurred to anyone because such sophisticated planning seemed impossible for someone in Samuel's position. By November, only 2 planters remained alive, and both were clearly dying. George Pemberton, the younger brother of the incompetent doctor who had treated all the victims, and Samuel Harrison, a man who had ironically shared the first name of his killer, though they had never met beyond the formal interactions of master and slave. Both men were bedridden, suffering from the advanced stages of poisoning, their bodies racked with tremors and pain. They had stopped drinking coffee weeks earlier, but the damage was already done. The toxin had accumulated in their organs, particularly their liver and nervous system, causing irreversible damage that no medical intervention of that era could address. Dr. Pemberton, finally recognizing that something unprecedented was occurring, called in specialists from Charleston and even Savannah. These were the most renowned physicians in the region, men who had trained in Europe and were familiar with the latest medical knowledge. They examined the dying men with great care, taking detailed notes on their symptoms, performing physical examinations, reviewing the case histories of all 9 victims. They performed autopsies on some of the earlier victims, examining the bodies that had been buried just weeks before, looking for any signs of disease or contamination that might explain the deaths. The autopsies revealed signs of tissue damage consistent with chronic poisoning. The livers showed unusual deterioration. The nervous systems showed signs of damage. But the specialists could not identify the specific agent responsible. They tested for known poisons like arsenic, mercury, and lead, using the limited analytical methods available in that era. They found traces of mercury in some bodies, but that was expected, given Dr. Pemberton's treatments. They found no arsenic or lead in quantities that would explain the symptoms. White snake root was not on their list of possible poisons because it was considered primarily a veterinary rather than human concern, and the connection between the plant and milk sickness was not widely known even in medical circles. Most doctors had never heard of it, and those who had considered it a problem only in frontier areas where cattle had access to wild plants. The specialists concluded that the victims were suffering from some form of neurological disease, possibly related to environmental contamination or some unknown pathogen. They wrote lengthy reports describing the symptoms and speculating about possible causes, but they could not provide a definitive diagnosis. Their recommendations focused on preventative measures, avoiding possible sources of contamination, improving sanitation, and monitoring other residents of the district for similar symptoms. These recommendations did nothing to save the dying men, but provided some comfort to the survivors, who felt that at least something was being done. George Pemberton died on November 20th, his death particularly hard on his brother, who had failed to save any of the 9 victims despite his medical training and years of practice. The doctor fell into a deep depression, drinking heavily, questioning his abilities, wondering if he had missed some obvious sign that might have saved his patients and his brother. He would spend the rest of his life haunted by these deaths, never knowing that no amount of medical skill could have saved them, because he had been treating symptoms without understanding their cause. Samuel Harrison lingered until December 3rd, the longest survivor of the 9, perhaps because he drank less coffee than the others, or perhaps because his body was stronger and able to resist the poison longer. He suffered terribly in his final weeks, fully conscious of his decline, watching his body fail despite every effort to save it. He spent his last days dictating letters to his family, settling his affairs, and trying to make sense of why he had been struck down in what should have been the prime of his life. He died in the early morning hours as winter was beginning to settle over the plantation lands. His death marking the end of the group of 9 planters who had gathered for dinner on July 15th. With Samuel Harrison's death, all 9 planters who had attended that dinner were gone, dead within 5 months of their gathering, and no one had identified the cause beyond vague references to an epidemic or environmental contamination. The investigation continued for several months, driven by the families of the deceased and by other planters in the region who feared they might be next. But the trail had gone completely cold. There was nothing to investigate beyond speculation and theories that could not be proven. The coffee containers had long since been emptied and replaced with new shipments. The white snakeroot plants that Samuel had harvested had returned to the forest, indistinguishable from countless other plants. There were no witnesses to Samuel's activities, no confession, no physical evidence connecting anyone to the deaths. The investigators interviewed hundreds of people, including every enslaved person who had worked at the 5 plantations. They questioned Samuel multiple times, along with every other enslaved worker who might have had access to food supplies or contact with the planters. Samuel answered their questions with the careful performance he had maintained his entire life, speaking in broken dialect, keeping his eyes downcast, appearing confused and frightened by the questioning. He told them he knew nothing about the deaths, that he had only done his assigned work, that he had never touched the master's food or coffee. Everything he said was true in the most literal sense, as he had not touched the coffee directly during the period when the planters consumed it. His contamination had occurred weeks earlier, during his normal cleaning duties, when his presence was expected and unremarkable. The investigators found no reason to suspect Samuel or any other specific individual. The deaths had occurred in a pattern that defied simple explanation. There was no single event, no single location, no single person who connected all the victims in a way that suggested deliberate murder. The planters had died at different times, in different places, from apparently different causes. The only common thread was their status as wealthy planters, but that commonality was too broad to point to any specific suspect or motive. The case gradually faded from active investigation into the category of unsolved mysteries, eventually attributed to some unknown environmental factor or disease that had briefly affected the region before disappearing. Medical journals published articles about the mysterious epidemic, speculating about novel diseases and environmental hazards. But without the ability to identify the actual cause, the speculation remained just that, speculation that led nowhere and explained nothing. Samuel's family was never sold. The chaos following James Blackwood's death, combined with the subsequent deaths of the other planters involved in the sale agreement, had disrupted the entire transaction. The slave trader in Charleston, faced with the death of his clients and the complexity of dealing with their estates, which were tied up in probate and family disputes, simply cancelled the sale and moved on to other business opportunities that were less complicated. The letter that had sentenced Samuel's family to separation became just another piece of paper in a file, forgotten in the larger crisis created by the deaths. Clara and the children remained on the plantation, now managed by James Blackwood's widow, Elizabeth, a woman who lacked her husband's enthusiasm for the more brutal aspects of slavery. Elizabeth had never been comfortable with the separation of families, had occasionally argued with her husband about his harsh treatment of enslaved people, and in the wake of his death found herself in control of the plantation with no desire to continue his policies. She was primarily concerned with maintaining the property until her son came of age to inherit it, and she chose the path of least resistance, allowing the plantation to continue functioning much as it had, but with less active cruelty. She rarely ordered whippings. She did not sell people to settle debts, and she generally left the enslaved community to manage itself with minimal interference. It was not freedom, not even approaching freedom, but it was an improvement over what had existed before. Samuel continued his life on the plantation exactly as before, performing the same tasks, maintaining the same demeanor, hiding his literacy and intelligence behind the mask of submissive labor. But something fundamental had changed, not just in him, but in the entire district. The deaths of the 9 planters had created a vacuum of power and authority that reshaped the local social structure. The remaining plantation owners were notably more cautious, more uncertain, more aware of their own mortality. The mysterious epidemic had reminded them that their wealth and status did not protect them from death, that they were as vulnerable as anyone else to forces they did not understand or control. Some of the surviving planters quietly began treating their enslaved workers with marginally more restraint, not from any moral awakening, but from a superstitious fear that cruelty might somehow attract the mysterious fate that had claimed their peers. Whippings became less frequent. Families were separated less often. The overall conditions of slavery remained brutal and unjust, but at the margins there was a slight easing of the most extreme cruelties. This was not Samuel's intention. He had acted solely to protect his own family, but it was an unintended consequence of his actions that benefited many others. Samuel lived for another 18 years after the deaths of the 9 planters, dying in 1840 of natural causes at age 52, which was old age for an enslaved person whose body had been worn down by decades of hard labor. He lived to see his children grow, to see Jacob become a blacksmith rather than a field worker, to see Sarah marry and have children of her own, to see his grandchildren born into a world that was slowly, painfully changing. He died quietly in his cabin, surrounded by Clara and his children, having never told anyone the truth about what he had done. His secret died with him, protected to the very end by his understanding that confession, even decades later, would serve no purpose and might endanger those he loved. Clara survived him by 7 years, dying in 1847 at age 61. She never remarried, living out her life as a widow, helping to raise her grandchildren and maintaining the small cabin that had been her home for nearly 3 decades. She had never asked Samuel directly about the deaths of the planters, understanding that there were things better left unspoken, but she had known in her bones that he had somehow been responsible for the change in their fortunes. She had seen the determination in his eyes after he discovered the letter, had noticed his unusual calm during the period when the planters were dying, had recognized that something fundamental had shifted in him, but she had kept this knowledge to herself, protecting him through silence, trusting that whatever he had done was necessary and just. Years later, long after both Samuel and Clara had died, the story of the 9 planters' deaths remained a local legend, one of those mysterious historical events that people discussed during long evenings, trying to puzzle out what had really happened. Various theories circulated about what had caused the epidemic. Some blamed contaminated water from a particular spring that had since dried up. Others suggested a fungus in the grain used to make bread, or a toxin in the meat from a diseased cow. A few whispered about poison administered by a secret network of slaves, but without evidence or specific suspects, these whispers never coalesced into anything more substantial. The prevailing theory, supported by the medical reports written at the time, was that the deaths had been caused by some unknown environmental factor or disease that had briefly appeared and then disappeared, a medical mystery that would never be solved. The truth died with Samuel, who never told anyone, not even Clara, exactly what he had done or how he had done it. He had understood from the beginning that the only way to commit the perfect crime was to leave absolutely no evidence, to create no conspiracies that might be betrayed, to trust no one with knowledge that could be extracted through torture or revealed in a moment of weakness or drunkenness. He had planned the deaths of 9 men, executed that plan flawlessly over a period of months, and taken the secret to his grave. His achievement was not celebrated, not recorded in history books, not acknowledged by anyone except perhaps himself in the private moments when he reflected on what he had done and why. What made Samuel's achievement remarkable was not simply the success of his plan, but the way it highlighted the fundamental paradox of slavery itself. The system was built on the assumption that enslaved people were property, incapable of complex thought or sophisticated planning, existing only to serve their master's interests. This assumption was essential to maintaining the system psychologically and legally. It allowed slaveholders to rationalize their actions, to treat human beings as objects without moral qualms, to maintain the fiction that slavery was a natural and beneficial institution. But this assumption was also the system's greatest vulnerability. By treating enslaved people as invisible and unintelligent, the masters made themselves vulnerable to invisible and intelligent attacks from those they believed incapable of such things. Samuel had understood this intuitively. He had recognized that his greatest weapon was not physical strength or violence, but the master's own blindness. Their inability to see him as a thinking human being capable of planning and executing sophisticated revenge. He had used their contempt against them, wielded their assumptions as a blade that cut deeper than any steel. The masters had discussed their private affairs in front of him, left their books accessible to him, trusted him with access to their homes and storage areas, all because they believed he was too simple to understand or pose any threat. This contemptuous trust had given him the opportunity to study, plan, and execute his revenge without ever arousing suspicion, and he had done it all without leaving a single trace, without creating any evidence that could be used to punish him or justify further oppression of others. This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his achievement. In an era when slave rebellions inevitably led to brutal crackdowns and collective punishment, when suspected conspiracies resulted in the execution of dozens or hundreds of people, Samuel had managed to kill 9 men without creating any backlash against the enslaved community. The authorities never identified the deaths as murder. They never arrested or interrogated suspects beyond routine questioning. They never implemented new restrictions or punishments in response to the deaths. Samuel had achieved perfect revenge without triggering the collective punishment that usually followed any act of resistance by enslaved people. The story raises uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the moral calculus of oppression that remain relevant centuries later. Samuel had killed 9 men, and by any legal standard of his time or ours, he was a murderer who had committed multiple homicides with premeditation and careful planning. If caught, he would have been tortured and executed in the most brutal manner possible, with his death designed to serve as a warning to other enslaved people about the consequences of harming white people. By modern legal standards, he would be considered a serial killer, someone who methodically planned and executed multiple murders over an extended period. But those 9 men had participated in and profited from a system that treated human beings as property, that separated families for financial gain, that maintained its power through systematic violence and degradation. They had signed bills of sale that destroyed families, had ordered whippings and punishments that left permanent physical and psychological scars, had worked people to death in their fields and replaced them with new purchases as casually as replacing worn-out tools or exhausted livestock. James Blackwood had personally signed the letter that would have destroyed Samuel's family, separating his wife and children and sending them to different plantations hundreds of miles apart, where they would never see each other again. The other 8 planters had done similar things countless times, treating the separation of families as a routine business transaction with no more moral weight than the sale of cotton or tobacco. From Samuel's perspective, his actions were not murder, but self-defense and defense of his family. The letter announcing the sale of Clara and his children was, in essence, a death sentence for his family as a unit. The fact that they would continue to live physically while being destroyed emotionally and psychologically did not make the violence any less real. They would be killed as a family, even though they would survive as individuals. Samuel had acted to prevent this violence by eliminating those who would perpetrate it, using the only method available to someone in his position. He could not appeal to the law, which recognized him as property rather than a person. He could not appeal to moral authority, as the church and social institutions of his time generally supported slavery. He could not run away with his family, as the distances were too great, and the apparatus of slave catchers and patrols too extensive. His only option was to eliminate the threat, and he did so using intelligence, patience, and careful planning. The perfectness of Samuel's crime lay not just in its execution, but in its invisibility. He had achieved what countless rebellions and uprisings had failed to achieve precisely because he understood that visible resistance would be crushed immediately. The history of slavery in America was filled with rebellions that had been suppressed with overwhelming violence. Nat Turner's rebellion had resulted in the deaths of over 200 black people, most of whom had nothing to do with the uprising. The Denmark VC conspiracy had led to 35 executions. The Stono rebellion had resulted in dozens of deaths and the implementation of even more restrictive slave codes. Every visible act of resistance had led to brutal retaliation and the strengthening of the very system it sought to undermine. Samuel had avoided this pattern by working within the system's own logic, using its assumptions and blind spots against itself. The deaths appeared natural because he had made them natural, employing poisons and methods that mimicked disease, creating a sequence of events that seemed like nothing more than tragic coincidence. The timing was spread out enough that no one connected the deaths initially. The symptoms were varied enough that different doctors attributed them to different causes. The delivery method was so subtle that no one even considered the possibility of deliberate poisoning until it was too late to find any evidence. Samuel had understood that the key to success was not in the act of killing, but in the concealment of that act, in making murder appear to be natural death. In the decades that followed Samuel's death, as the debates over slavery intensified and the nation moved toward the civil war that would finally end the institution, the story of the 9 planters remained unknown except as a local medical mystery. Samuel's achievement was never celebrated or even acknowledged because no one knew it had occurred. He had saved his family and achieved perfect revenge against those who would have destroyed them. And he had done so in complete silence, leaving behind no evidence, no trace, no story that could be told in his own time. His name appeared in plantation records only as a piece of property, valued at $800 in the estate inventory after James Blackwood's death. There was no mention of his literacy, his intelligence, or his remarkable achievement. He was simply Samuel, aged 36 at the time of the inventory, described as a house servant and laborer, unremarkable in every official record. This silence was both his triumph and his tragedy. He had succeeded completely in protecting his family and eliminating the threat against them, but his success required that it remain invisible, unacknowledged, unknown. He could never tell his story, never claim credit for his intelligence and planning, never be recognized for the remarkable feat he had achieved. He lived and died as a slave in the eyes of those around him, and only in the private spaces of his own mind could he acknowledge the truth of what he had done. This must have been a profound burden, carrying such a secret for 18 years, never being able to share the knowledge of his achievement with anyone, not even his wife or children. The historical record contains only fragments of this story, pieced together from death certificates filed in county records, estate inventories that list enslaved people as property, medical reports written by confused doctors, and the scattered memories of enslaved people who passed down oral histories through generations. The names used here have been changed to protect the identities of descendants who still live in the region. The specific locations have been obscured because even now, centuries after these events, the implications of this story remain uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. We prefer our heroes to be clear and our villains obvious. We prefer our justice to be legal and our violence to be sanctioned by proper authority. We prefer our historical narratives to be simple, with good people fighting bad people through approved methods that respect established laws and customs. Samuel's story fits none of these comfortable categories. He was neither hero nor villain in any simple sense, but something more complex and difficult to categorize. He was a human being, pushed beyond the limits of endurance, who used the only power available to him to protect what he loved. He was a murderer who killed to prevent his family from being destroyed. He was a slave who used literacy and intelligence to strike back at those who enslaved him. He was a victim who became a perpetrator, a powerless person who seized power through secret means. A man who achieved justice outside any legal framework by creating his own form of retribution. His story forces us to confront difficult questions about the nature of justice in unjust systems. When the law itself is unjust, when the legal system treats some people as property and denies them any avenue for legitimate grievance, What options remain for those who suffer under such a system? When the separation of families is legal, when the buying and selling of human beings is sanctioned by law and church and custom, what can those who are bought and sold do to protect themselves? When every legitimate path to justice is blocked, when even literacy is criminalized as too dangerous for enslaved people to possess, what forms of resistance are possible? Samuel's answer was to work in silence and secrecy, to use the master's assumptions against them, to achieve his goal without leaving any trace that might endanger others. His method was perfect in its way, protecting not just himself and his family, but the entire enslaved community from the collective punishment that usually followed any act of resistance. But it was also limited in its impact. He saved his own family, but could not save others. He killed 9 planters, but could not destroy the system they represented. He achieved perfect revenge, but in a way that could never be acknowledged or celebrated. Never serve as an example or inspiration to others. Never be recorded in the historical record as an act of resistance. What remains most remarkable about Samuel's achievement is how it reveals the hidden history of slavery, the countless acts of resistance and defiance that occurred in silence, leaving no trace in the historical record that historians later would study. For every rebellion that was recorded and suppressed, there were likely thousands of smaller acts of resistance that succeeded precisely because they remained invisible. Enslaved people who appeared most docile and submissive might have been the most dangerous, using their master's blindness as both shield and weapon. Samuel's story suggests that the historical record, which emphasizes visible rebellions and documented resistance movements, may miss the majority of actual resistance, which occurred in forms too subtle to be detected or recorded. The 9 planters died believing they were victims of disease or misfortune, never knowing that they had been deliberately killed by someone they considered property. Their families mourned them and built monuments to their memory. Edward Whitmore was buried beneath an elaborate marble tombstone that praised his Christian virtues and business acumen. James Blackwood's grave was marked with an obelisk that detailed his accomplishments as a planter and community leader. The other 7 received similar monuments, permanent records in stone that celebrated their lives and mourned their deaths. None of these monuments mentioned that they had died from drinking poisoned coffee, prepared by a slave they never noticed and whose name they probably never knew. Their estates were divided and passed down through generations. The land they had owned, purchased with the profits of slave labor, became the inheritance of their children and grandchildren. The enslaved people they had owned, including Samuel and his family, were distributed among heirs or sold to settle debts. The system they had maintained continued for several more decades until it was finally destroyed, not by invisible poison, but by visible war. The Civil War that erupted in 1861, nearly 40 years after Samuel's actions, would eventually end slavery through violence on a massive scale, with hundreds of thousands of deaths and the complete destruction of the plantation economy that had dominated the South. But in one small corner of that vast system, in one brief moment of that long history, a literate slave had achieved perfect justice without leaving a single trace. He had protected his family by destroying those who threatened them. He had used intelligence and knowledge as weapons against an enemy that never saw him as intelligent or knowledgeable. He had planned with the patience and precision of someone who understood that he would have only one chance, and he had executed his plan so perfectly that no one ever suspected what he had done. The legacy of Samuel's actions extends beyond his immediate family. His children and grandchildren, who remained together because of what he had done, went on to have families of their own. When emancipation finally came in 1865, they were among the formerly enslaved people who built new lives in freedom. Jacob, Samuel's son, became a successful blacksmith, using skills he had learned on the plantation to establish a business that served both black and white customers in the years after the war. Sarah, his daughter, married a man who had also been enslaved, and together they farmed a small piece of land they managed to purchase in the 1870s. Their children and grandchildren spread across the south and eventually to the north and west, carrying with them the genetic and cultural legacy of Samuel and Clara, though none of them knew the story of what Samuel had done to keep the family together. This unknown legacy is perhaps the most poignant aspect of Samuel's story. His descendants lived free lives that would not have been possible if he had not acted, but they never knew that their freedom was purchased through his careful planning and ruthless execution. They grew up hearing stories about their enslaved ancestors, about the hardships they had endured, about their survival and eventual freedom. But they never heard the story of how one man had used his hidden literacy and intelligence to strike back at those who would have destroyed his family. That story died with Samuel, its details lost forever, its truth reduced to fragments and speculation, pieced together by historians working from incomplete records and oral traditions passed down through generations. The silence surrounding Samuel's achievement was necessary for his success and survival, but it also means that his remarkable feat remains unacknowledged in the historical record. He achieved something that should be celebrated as an example of intelligence, courage, and determination in the face of overwhelming oppression. He protected his family through means that required extraordinary planning and self-control. He struck a blow against a system that dehumanized him and millions of others. But because the nature of his achievement required secrecy, because any acknowledgement of what he had done would have resulted in his death and the punishment of others, his story could not be told in his own time and exists now only as a reconstruction based on fragments of evidence. This raises questions about how many other stories like Samuel's exist in the hidden history of slavery, stories that cannot be told because they involved actions that needed to remain secret to be successful. How many other enslaved people used their intelligence and knowledge in similar ways, striking back at their oppressors through means that left no trace? How many acts of resistance went unrecorded because they were too subtle to be detected or because the participants took their secrets to their graves? The historical record tends to preserve dramatic events, rebellions that involved violence and were therefore noticed and suppressed. But it may miss the quiet acts of resistance that succeeded precisely because they were invisible. Samuel's story also reveals something important about literacy and knowledge as forms of power in systems designed to keep certain people powerless. The slave-holding states had laws against teaching enslaved people to read, specifically because they understood that literacy was dangerous to the maintenance of slavery. A literate slave could read newspapers and learn about abolitionist movements, could read the Bible, and find passages that contradicted the religious justifications for slavery, could read legal documents and understand the mechanisms through which they were oppressed, could communicate across distances through written messages that overseers could not monitor. Literacy opened doors that the system needed to keep closed. Samuel's literacy, acquired accidentally through his childhood friendship with Thomas Blackwood, gave him access to knowledge that transformed him from a piece of property into an agent capable of sophisticated planning and action. He read medical texts and learned about poisons. He read newspapers and understood the political debates about slavery. He read ledgers and comprehended the economic structures that sustained the plantation system. This knowledge did not free him legally, but it freed him mentally, allowing him to see the system clearly rather than accepting the myths and justifications that surrounded it. And it gave him the tools to act against that system in ways that illiterate people could not. The irony is that Thomas Blackwood, by teaching Samuel to read, had inadvertently created the instrument of his father's destruction. The young boy, sharing his lessons in innocent friendship, had given Samuel the weapon that he would eventually use to kill James Blackwood. This speaks to the unpredictable consequences of education and knowledge. The way that information shared for one purpose can be used for entirely different ends. Thomas had meant only to share his lessons with his friend, to pass the time during his long illnesses by teaching someone else what he was learning. He could not have imagined that this act of friendship would eventually result in his father's death decades later. The period during which Samuel carried out his plan, from June through December of 1822, was a time of heightened tension throughout the South regarding slavery and potential rebellions. The Denmark-Vesey conspiracy had been discovered in Charleston just months earlier, leading to widespread panic among slaveholders and the implementation of even stricter controls on enslaved populations. Patrols were increased, restrictions on movement were tightened, and any hint of unusual behavior among enslaved people was investigated with brutal thoroughness. Samuel carried out his plan during this period of heightened vigilance, which made his success even more remarkable. He succeeded where others failed because he understood that the authorities were looking for visible signs of resistance. Gatherings, weapons, messages passed between plantations. Any indication of organized rebellion. They were not looking for a single individual working alone, using poison obtained from common plants, targeting victims through a delivery method so subtle that it seemed like natural death. Samuel had read about previous rebellions in newspapers that the masters left lying around, and he had learned from their failures. Nat Turner had gathered followers and used violence, which led to his discovery and execution. Denmark-Vesey had tried to organize a large-scale uprising, which was betrayed before it could begin. Gabriel Prosser had attempted to recruit hundreds of participants, which made secrecy impossible. Samuel avoided all these mistakes by working alone, using subtle methods, and leaving no evidence that could be traced back to him. His success also depended on his understanding of the medical knowledge and forensic capabilities of his era. Samuel knew from his reading that doctors in 1822 had limited ability to detect poisons in the body. Autopsy techniques were primitive. Toxicology as a science barely existed, and most physicians relied on observation of symptoms rather than any kind of chemical analysis. This meant that a poison that mimicked natural disease would be nearly impossible to identify as such. Whitesnake root was perfect for this purpose because its symptoms resembled various common ailments and because almost no one knew about it. Even if someone had suspected poisoning, they would have looked for common poisons like arsenic or strychnine, not for an obscure plant toxin that most doctors had never heard of. The choice of coffee as the delivery mechanism was equally brilliant because it was something the planters consumed multiple times daily, because it came in large shipments that could be contaminated all at once, and because its strong, bitter taste would mask any slight change in flavor from the added plant material. Samuel had tested this carefully, mixing small amounts of the powder into his own coffee and finding that it was undetectable to taste. The planters, who prided themselves on their refined palates and their ability to distinguish quality coffee, never noticed that their expensive imported beans had been adulterated with poison. The psychological burden of what Samuel did must have been enormous. He spent months planning and preparing, knowing that any mistake would result in his death and likely the death of his family as well. He watched the men he had poisoned die slowly and painfully, maintaining his mask of submissive obedience while internally tracking the progress of his plan. He attended their funerals, dug their graves, listened to eulogies that praised them as good Christian men, all while knowing that he was responsible for their deaths. And he lived with this knowledge for 18 years afterward, never telling anyone, never seeking acknowledgement or recognition, carrying the secret alone until his death. This psychological burden was compounded by the fact that Samuel was not a naturally violent or cruel person. He had killed because he believed he had no other choice, because the alternative was the destruction of his family. But killing 9 men, even many viewed as enemies, must have affected him deeply. He would have seen their suffering, heard their cries of pain, watched them waste away over weeks. He would have known that they left behind widows and children who mourned them. He would have understood that his actions had caused pain to people who were themselves innocent of any direct crime against him. This knowledge must have weighed on him, even as he believed his actions were justified. The moral complexity of Samuel's situation resists easy judgment. From one perspective, he was a murderer who killed 9 men through premeditated poisoning, an act that caused tremendous suffering both to his victims and to their families. From another perspective, he was a desperate man, protecting his family from a system that would have torn them apart without a second thought, using the only means available to him. From yet another perspective, he was a revolutionary striking back against oppressors who had built their wealth on the suffering of others, targeting individuals who were complicit in and benefited from a deeply evil system. All of these perspectives contain truth, and none of them can be dismissed as simply wrong. The question of whether Samuel's actions were justified depends on one's view of slavery itself and of what actions are permissible in resisting unjust systems. If slavery was an absolute evil that dehumanized and destroyed millions of people, then striking back against those who maintained that system can be seen as an act of justified resistance. If human life is sacred regardless of circumstances, then killing 9 men, however evil their actions, was itself evil. If the protection of family is a fundamental human right, then Samuel's actions to prevent his family's destruction can be understood as self-defense. These are not easy questions, and they remain relevant today as we continue to grapple with questions of justice, resistance, and the moral limits of action against unjust systems. What is clear is that Samuel's actions were effective in achieving their immediate goal. He saved his family from separation and sale. Clara, Jacob, and Sarah remained together on the Blackwood plantation and eventually gained their freedom when the Civil War ended slavery. They went on to live full lives that would have been impossible if Samuel had not acted. In this sense, his plan succeeded completely, but the cost of that success was high, measured not just in the deaths of 9 men, but in the psychological burden Samuel carried for the rest of his life. In the secret he could never share, in the recognition and acknowledgement he could never receive. The impact of Samuel's actions extended beyond his immediate family in ways he could not have anticipated. The deaths of the 9 planters created a power vacuum in the local planter class that took years to fill. Younger men, often the sons of the deceased, took over the plantations, but they lacked the authority and confidence of their fathers. The mysterious nature of the deaths created a sense of unease and vulnerability among the surviving planters, who could not shake the feeling that something had struck them that they did not understand or control. This unease manifested in subtle changes in behavior, a slight easing of the most extreme cruelties, a greater caution in decision-making. The deaths also disrupted business relationships and financial arrangements that had taken years to establish. The 9 planters had been interconnected through various business dealings, shared investments, and mutual obligations. Their simultaneous deaths created complications in settling estates, fulfilling contracts, and maintaining the economic networks that sustained the plantation economy. Some of these complications worked to the benefit of enslaved people, as sales were cancelled, debts were forgiven, and new arrangements had to be negotiated. Samuel's family was not the only one that benefited from the chaos created by the deaths. In the broader historical context, Samuel's story is one small episode in the long history of resistance to slavery in America. That resistance took many forms, from open rebellion to subtle sabotage, from escape to survival, from physical violence to cultural preservation. Samuel's method, using literacy and knowledge as weapons in a carefully planned, invisible attack, represents a form of resistance that is less well documented than dramatic rebellions, but may have been more common and more effective. The invisible resistance, the quiet acts of sabotage and revenge that left no trace, may have been the most successful forms of resistance precisely because they could not be suppressed through the brutal retaliation that followed visible rebellions. The fact that Samuel's story is unknown except as speculation and reconstruction from fragments of evidence is itself significant. It suggests that the historical record is incomplete, that we know only a fraction of what actually occurred during the centuries of slavery in America. The stories we have are primarily those that were documented by the slaveholding class, or those that involved events dramatic enough to be noticed and recorded. But the everyday resistance, the quiet victories, the subtle acts of defiance and revenge that succeeded precisely because they remained invisible, these are largely lost to history. Samuel's story may be one of many such stories that can never be fully told because the participants took their secrets to their graves. In trying to understand Samuel's achievement, it is important to recognize the extraordinary intelligence and self-control it required. He had to plan every detail perfectly, knowing that any mistake would be fatal. He had to maintain his performance of submissive obedience for months while carrying out his plan, never showing any sign of the anger and determination that drove him. He had to resist the temptation to tell anyone, even those he trusted most, because any shared knowledge would increase the risk of discovery. He had to watch his victims die slowly and painfully without showing any reaction that might be remembered as suspicious. And then he had to live with what he had done for 18 years, never seeking recognition, never claiming credit, never using his achievement as an example or inspiration to others. This level of discipline and self-control speaks to resources of character that are easy to overlook when thinking about enslaved people. The historical record often portrays enslaved people as victims, emphasizing their suffering and oppression. This emphasis is important for understanding the evil of slavery, but it can inadvertently minimize the agency, intelligence, and capability of enslaved people themselves. Samuel's story is a reminder that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents who used whatever tools and knowledge they could access to resist their oppression and protect what they loved. They were not simply people who suffered, but people who thought, planned, and acted in sophisticated ways despite the enormous constraints placed upon them. The use of white snake root as a poison demonstrates Samuel's botanical knowledge and his ability to apply information from books to practical problems. He had to identify the plant correctly in the wild, understanding which parts were toxic and how they should be prepared. He had to harvest it without being noticed, process it into a usable form, and test it to ensure it would work as planned. He had to calculate dosages that would be fatal over time, but not immediately, that would accumulate in the body without causing symptoms that would be traced to a specific source. This required not just reading, but understanding, not just knowledge, but the ability to apply that knowledge creatively to a unique situation. The delivery method he chose shows similar sophistication. He recognized that coffee was the ideal vehicle because of its ubiquity in the planters' lives, its strong flavor that would mask the poison, and the fact that it came in large shipments that could be contaminated all at once. He understood the logistics of how coffee was stored and distributed on plantations. He positioned himself to have access to storage areas across multiple plantations through normal work rotations. He contaminated the coffee supplies systematically, ensuring even distribution of the poison, leaving no trace of tampering. Every step required careful thought and execution. The timing of his actions shows strategic thinking about when to act and how long to wait between steps. He contaminated the coffee supplies over a period of 10 days, spacing out his activities to avoid establishing a pattern. He waited weeks for the symptoms to appear, knowing that patience was essential to avoid any temporal connection between his actions and the deaths. He allowed the deaths to occur over months rather than all at once, creating the appearance of coincidental natural causes rather than a coordinated attack. This patience and strategic timing were as important as any other aspect of his plan. Samuel's achievement also demonstrates his understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. He knew how the planters would react to mysterious illnesses, how doctors would diagnose symptoms based on visible signs without sophisticated testing, how authorities would investigate deaths without modern forensic tools. He anticipated that the planters would blame environmental factors or contagion rather than deliberate poisoning. He understood that his own invisibility as a slave would protect him from suspicion as long as he left no physical evidence. He recognized that the social assumptions of his era, which held that enslaved people were incapable of sophisticated planning, would work in his favor as long as he maintained his performance of submissive simplicity. The success of his plan depended on all these elements working together: the right poison, the right delivery method, the right timing, the right understanding of how people would react and investigate. Any failure in any element would have resulted in his discovery and execution. The fact that everything worked exactly as planned speaks to the extraordinary nature of what he accomplished. This was not luck or accident, but the result of careful thought, patient preparation, and flawless execution. In the final analysis, Samuel's story is about power and powerlessness, about how someone who appeared powerless found a way to exercise power against those who oppressed him. He could not change the system of slavery through legal means, political action, or open rebellion. But he could protect his family through hidden action that used the master's assumptions against them. He transformed his apparent powerlessness into actual power through intelligence, knowledge, and ruthless determination. His story suggests that power is never absolute, that even in the most oppressive systems, there are ways for the oppressed to act, to resist, to strike back at those who harm them. The tragedy is that this power could only be exercised in secret, that its exercise could never be acknowledged or celebrated, that it had to remain invisible to be effective. Samuel achieved something remarkable, but he could never tell anyone about it. He protected his family, but at the cost of carrying an enormous secret alone until his death. He struck a blow against the system that oppressed him, but it was a blow that no one recognized as such. His victory was real but silent, effective but invisible, successful but forever unacknowledged. This was the price of success in a system designed to prevent any form of resistance, the cost of winning when the rules prohibited victory.